What's up guys, my name is Ace, and the open beta for XDefiant is going live tomorrow, and I know a lot of you guys are going to be hopping in for the first time, or many of you maybe got to dabble with the game a bit when it was in the closed session. And to set you guys up, in today's video, I wanted to share the best settings, including controller settings, that I found that work really well for me while playing in the last beta. Now, obviously, just like with any settings video, especially when we're talking about sensitivity values and stuff like that, at the end of the day, this is going to come down to preference. And of course, I recommend making adjustments to better suit you and your playstyle and what kind of feel you're looking for. However, what I always go for is I try to get that feel kind of similar to what I experience in Call of Duty, and it did take me quite a bit of playing around with the controller settings to get to that point, so at the very least, perhaps you could use these settings as a starting point and then just tweak from there. Also, of course, these are just my beta settings, and it is possible that I will still make adjustments from here going forward, especially with any changes they end up making in the game that may also change the settings that I use over time. And diving right in, let's start this off with the gameplay and UI settings here. I found for field of view, right around 100 to 105 was best for me. Again, that is going to be largely based on preference. Just know the higher you go in FOV, the smaller targets will appear at longer ranges, whereas the lower the field of view goes, the bigger targets will appear at longer ranges, but the less you'll be able to see in your peripheral vision. So for me, that sweet spot is right around 100 to 105. Then when it comes to our aim down sight field of view, I like keeping this consistent. This keeps you a little bit more zoomed out when you have a higher field of view, even while aiming down sights. And this does tend to reduce how much visual recoil you see and how much shake you generally see. And I do find that actually helps control recoil a bit, even though it doesn't directly impact the recoil you experience. After that, when it comes to our aim down sight sensitivity transition, I like to keep this at instant. This is how Call of Duty handles it. This means the moment you start aiming down sight as you're panning over, it will instantly transition into your aim down sight sensitivity, which we'll get into that value in a little bit. Then for the rest of these settings, I'm pretty sure I just kept them all default. You guys can just copy them for yourselves if I did change anything here, but nothing too out of the ordinary when it comes to this. And now let's get into the main part of this video. This is the controller settings themselves. Now for the button layout, I use Brawler, which is equal to the tactical button layout in Call of Duty. For all you Call of Duty players out there, that just swaps crouch and melee so that you can do the crouching with your analog stick. You don't have to take your thumb off in order to crouch. Then I played around with aim assist a lot in the closed beta, and at the end of the day, I just stuck to standard with both of these values set to 0. I tried turning these values down, some people recommended that, and I just found that if I just left it standard, it worked the best for me, so I just left it there. And then when it comes to aim response curve, this one is really going to come down to preference. I like standard, and I like standard in Call of Duty as well, but some people will like linear, and this is equal to linear in Call of Duty, to my knowledge at least. And then the reverse S curve, this is equal to the dynamic response curve in Call of Duty. So if you use dynamic in Call of Duty, you'll probably want to go with reverse S curve, but for me, I just use standard. And then let's get into our aim down sight sensitivity value. And for me, in Call of Duty, I usually keep this around 0.7 to 0.75. However, in XDefiant, I find I like to go a little bit lower with this value. I think it's just the ratio between your aim down sight sensitivity versus your standard sensitivity just feels somehow different in XDefiant. So I like to use 0.6 for this value. This just gives me a little bit more fine control while aiming down sight, which is where you need it the most in order to control recoil or just to finally adjust to your target. Whereas when I'm not aiming down sight, I like to be able to turn at least reasonably quickly. Having said that though, when it comes to our scope look sensitivity factor, I leave this one at 1. And the reason behind this is when you're zoomed in much farther, it can be harder to track moving targets, especially if they're in somewhat close ranges. Your sensitivity won't be able to keep up if you drop this value, so I like just leaving it at 1 there. Then I don't play inverted at all, so those are disabled. And now let's get into my sensitivity values, and I've actually found 50 and 50 seems to work best for me, and keep in mind, from Call of Duty, I generally play on a 7 to 8 sensitivity value. So I'd say if you're a Call of Duty player that plays on a lower sensitivity value than that, then you probably want to drop below 50 here, whereas if you play on a higher sensitivity value than a 7 or 8, you'll probably want to be increasing these values. But for me, that sweet spot seems to be right around that 50 mark. It allows me to spin reasonably quickly if somebody ends up behind me, for instance. And then I use that lower aim look sensitivity to still maintain that precision while aiming down sight. After that, there is an acceleration speed multiplier, and this is for when you've fully deflected the right stick. It just gives you that little bit of extra acceleration on top of the standard acceleration, and this can be used so you can get even faster spins if you really want to pull a 180 super quickly. And with this, I did play around with it quite a bit in the closed beta, and for some time I was using a slightly higher value here, but I just found this was introducing some inconsistency that I didn't really like, and since then I have dropped this down to a 1, and I do feel more comfortable with this. As for the next set of settings, these are our dead zone values, and just like with any FPS game with this, you want these values to be as low as possible without getting stick drift. So the way to test this is set this super low, like even all the way down to 1, and then put yourself in a game or just in the firing range and set your controller down. If your aim is moving without any input, that means you're experiencing stick drift. So then you bump it up a little bit and just find that point where you no longer get any of that stick drift. And that's the sweet spot value for you and your particular controller, and this will just depend on the controller that you're using. And then finally, for the controller settings, when it comes to controller vibration, I personally just leave that off. I find vibration to be an unnecessary distraction. I just don't see any need for it, so I personally leave it off, but that's obviously preference-based. So there we go, that wraps it up for the controller settings. Now let's quickly blast through audio. I just like keeping my music volume a little bit lower. I don't use voice chat in-game as well. When it comes to video settings, keep in mind I am playing on PS5. You will have different settings depending on the platform, especially if you're on PC, you'll have access to a lot more settings. But I just want to make sure you guys know if you are on one of the newer generation consoles, make sure you enable that 120 Hz refresh rate if you have a monitor or TV that supports that. That's going to make a big difference for you. And then I also wanted to remind you guys, we do have the ability to turn crossplay on or off in the XDefiant Beta. And for me, I generally like playing with it off just for consistency between all of the players involved. But that is going to lead to longer matchmaking times and potentially a worse connection experience. I'm not too sure how they're handling that. But the more you limit the player pool you can connect to, the higher the odds are that you may end up with a worse connection. And with that, that's pretty much it. That's going to wrap it up for all of the settings that I found were best for the closed beta of XDefiant. And this is at least going to be my starting point going into the open beta of XDefiant. Although I probably will be fine-tuning some of these as time goes on, especially now that we do have significantly improved input lag on controller on console, because that was in a very different state with the previous closed beta. And I already noticed immediately when I played around with this a bit, since it reopened in the closed beta this morning, that input lag is significantly improved. So like I said, that may change some of these to a small degree, but I don't anticipate any major changes to my settings throughout this beta. But with that, that is going to wrap it up for today's video. For those that are wondering, I will be streaming XDefiant most likely tomorrow. Unfortunately for me today, they have already opened up the closed portion of this beta to anybody that's already played in a closed beta in the past. But unfortunately, I've got a dentist appointment today, so I won't be able to be streaming XDefiant today. Probably won't get too much playtime as well. But definitely tomorrow, I will be streaming this game, so if you guys haven't followed my Twitch yet, I will leave a link to that in the description down below. If you guys enjoyed this video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.